Hi everyone, today we are going to cover the bird opening or the bird's opening or the reverse Dutch or 1f4, whatever you want to call it. One of the sharpest and most interesting first moves for white that I've played myself. I enjoy playing it and I actually enjoy playing it with both sides. So the bird opening is pawn to f4, and according to classical principles this is unsound compared to e4, d4, c4, knight f3. According to the engine, black is already equal or slightly better. Now you may think, well, why is that? Why would white have a slight disadvantage if the Dutch is a normal opening? So if we play d4 as white and black plays f5, the Dutch, white has a plus 0.5 advantage. If we go f4 as white, black has a minus 0.2 advantage. So according to the engine, the Dutch is bad with both colors. It doesn't matter if you have an extra move, but with the bird, if black transposes to the Dutch, white does have an extra move, and from a human perspective, that's very important. The fact that the engine says minus 0.2 is completely irrelevant. So why is f4 risky? Well, first of all, you're not doing anything to develop your pieces early on, and you're opening up some lines towards your king. And generally, moving the f-pawn is one of the worst ways to start a game if you don't know what you're doing. However, the bird is also a very sharp opening, a very aggressive opening, a very flexible opening, an opening in which white chooses the nature of the position. And most importantly, if you know your setups, if you know what you're doing, you're going to have a comfortable game because you have more experience than black in the lines that are going to occur. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be focusing on ideas instead of theory. I'm not going to bore you with 20 move lines or anything like that. I'll try to explain what white is trying to achieve, and I'll try to explain how black can fight this. First of all, let's consider black's options. Based on them, white will have to choose a setup. Black has several options. By far the most aggressive and challenging one, although as a bird player myself, and I haven't started playing it in tournament games yet, but I have played it in many training games, e5 is not challenging to me because I know the theory. The from Gambit is the most aggressive approach. And I'm going to show you the from Gambit today, but I'm also going to post a separate video in a lot of detail where I will go over my own preparation for the from Gambit or against the from Gambit so that you have a bulletproof bird repertoire as white. So the from Gambit challenges the f-pawn and tries to open up lines. It does sacrifice a pawn, and we will get to this. It's sharp, and I think white is significantly better if this happens. The second option, probably the most popular on a high level, is simply transposing to a Dutch defense. So imagine if white plays d4 on move 1 and black plays f5. This is the Dutch, white is a tempo up. If the Dutch is a sound opening, and it is, it has been played by many strong players, then this has to be fine. So saying that the bird is an unsound opening really isn't true if black plays the Dutch. Okay, the third most common setup for black, or type of setup, begins with pawn to c4, and in most cases black will play c5. Black will play c5 if they normally play the Sicilian or the Benoni, or if they play the symmetrical English against the English. People who play c5 usually play c5 against everything. Against this, white has several options, and I would advise you to stop with the bird at this point and transpose to a Sicilian defense with e4, the McDonald attack or the Grand Prix or whatever you want to call it, because this is the way to play for an advantage. That being said, you don't have to. You can stick to your own stuff and you can stick to what I'm about to show you, but playing e4 is the critical line. The downside is you will be playing into black's hand. Psychologically, black has an advantage because the bird is an opening it's a singular opening. You're not offering black a choice of many defenses. You're playing the bird, that's it. Black has to react. If on f4 black plays c5 and you go e4, then you were saying, okay, let's play the bird. Black has no, let's play the Sicilian. And you say, okay. So you're kind of conceding the opening psychological battle to black. That being said, e4 is the best move. There are also rare moves for black. We're going to briefly look at copying white, playing b6, playing g6, playing d6. We're going to cover all of those with basic ideas. Before we do, let's look at some pawn structures. Understanding the bird begins with understanding the pawn structures. So for those of you who play the Dutch, this will make a lot of sense. For those of you who don't play the Dutch, hopefully you know at least something about these setups. There are three Dutch setups: the classical Dutch, which you can see on the screen, the Leningrad Dutch, which you can see now, which is a kingside fianchetto for white, and the Stonewall Dutch, where white or black, if the Dutch is played with the black pieces, creates this stone wall of pawns with pawns on d4, f4, or as black, d5, f5, shutting in the c1 bishop. This is a very, very aggressive setup. White launches an attack via e5 with the knight, the queen comes to the king side, and so on and so forth. But strategically, it's very suspicious. I scored extremely well against this with both sides, whether I'm facing the stone wall with white or with black, and I did face it with both colors, because there are some strategic exchanges you can play for that neutralize black's chances, or in this case, white's chances. And the fourth setup, which isn't a Dutch setup, which you have to be aware of if you play the bird, is the Grand Prix attack, or the Grand Prix setup. Now, if f4, c5, e4, technically that's the McDonald attack in the Sicilian, but you're going to get something like this. So, as opposed to the classical Dutch, if we go back to it for a second, the bishop is not inside the pawn chain, the pawn is not on e3, it's on e4, so you're claiming space in the center, and you're basically left with a position in which you have more space, equally strong attacking chances. However, black has many more theoretical ideas to fight against this. So once again, if you play the bird, you should go for one of the Dutch setups against everything black plays. I can tell you straight away that most people play the Leningrad Dutch when they play the bird with white. By far the most common setup is g3, bishop g2, knight f3 in the first few moves. This is considered to be the sharpest and the main line. The Stonewall in reverse very rarely begins with f4. Usually people start the Stonewall with d4, e3, bishop d3 to avoid the from Gambit and all that other nonsense. So if you want to play the Stonewall in reverse, I would advise you to start with d4. Now, there are other ways to avoid the stone wall if you go d4, but you avoid e5. And the classical, which is my favorite, is frowned upon by the engine. Black is supposed to be minus 0.4, minus 0.5. But it's the safest of the three, and it's in many ways also the sharpest of the three, because you reduce the amount of counterplay black has. You also don't concede a strategic advantage to black because you have no bad pieces, and the attacking plans are very, very simple. If you want to learn the classical Dutch, look at games by Simon Williams, the Ginger GM. He plays it with black, but the ideas are basically the same. Now, before we begin with the actual setups, if you want an easy way to learn any opening, you can use Chessbook. I've been using it for a year now. It's extremely effective, and it's the easiest way I could find to build my repertoire, to keep expanding my repertoire, and it's the easiest way to learn my repertoire. So I've created a bird repertoire. As you can see, it's over 350 moves long. It's very, very effective, and I can continue building it. What I can do is I can import parts of my repertoire via PGNs. So what I normally do is I prepare a Lichess study on a specific variation, then I import it as a PGN. You can also edit it by going through your biggest gaps or editing specific parts of your repertoire. Also, you can import it as a pre-made repertoire. It will be up here today, probably. If not, then tomorrow. I've already prepared repertoires on the Nimzo Larsen, Reti, and London. You will also have a bird repertoire available. So the great thing about this is that you can choose your repertoire settings to suit your strength and style. So for example, I've chosen to cover every move that comes up in one of 400 games. If you do that, you will have covered most of the details in your openings, and Chessbook is going to help you do that. If you have any gaps in your repertoire, and let's say you go to your biggest gap, it's going to find the gap in a specific transposition that you haven't covered. So, and it's also going to say what's consistent with your repertoire. It should be easy to remember because it's similar to the rest of your repertoire. It says what most masters play, it gives you the evaluation, and it gives you the score. So bishop g2. Now, you can see that obviously I haven't missed this position in the repertoire, it's just a transposition. So now let's say after bishop g7, it's going to take me back to my repertoire. We have transposed. We can keep adding moves or save this or ask Chessbook how to play from here. Then it's going to give you plans. So instead of using Lichess and just going through master games, instead of watching videos, using this and your own brain is, in my opinion, the most effective way to learn an opening. Once again, a pre-made bird repertoire will be available soon. If you want to check out Chessbook, there is a link in the description. And thank you. Let me know what you think about it. Let's go back to the video. I should say that you don't have to start the bird with 1f4. I like starting the game with b3 in some cases. And in the classical Dutch, this bishop sometimes stays on c1 and develops on this diagonal. Sometimes with black usually plays b6, bishop b7 if given time, if white doesn't play against the Dutch with the g3 setup. So for example, if white plays g3 against the Dutch immediately, black will never have time for b6, bishop b7. However, if white doesn't do that, then in many cases, a classical Dutch player can play b6, bishop b7, challenge this diagonal. So if we go back, you can also start the bird with pawn to b3, the Nimzo Larsen technically, if you like playing the classical Dutch. If you want to play the Stonewall or the Leningrad, don't do that. Now let's begin. The from Gambit. So what's the idea? Excuse me, not e4, f4, e5. So f4, e5. Black is challenging this pawn straight away. Good morning, Lucia. I woke her up with chess again. So this pawn is challenged. You have no decent way to defend the pawn. If you play, I don't know, e3, defending the pawn, then the e file opens up. If you play g3, you have no kingside pawns. And after the trade, you can actually get mated. For example, they don't do something like this. This is checkmate. So this pawn really must be taken. We take a pawn, and now black plays d6, challenging the pawn once again. So what's the point? The point is black is sacrificing both of their central pawns in order to do stuff like this, to get to this diagonal. Once again, you move your g pawn, you get mated. So it is very scary. And I've lost many games, bullet games and blitz games in this line, but after I've studied it for a long time, now I just keep winning. So white can take the second pawn or not take the second pawn. You can take on d6 or play knight f3 defending e5. Regardless of what you decide to do, black is going to have a huge initiative. Also, regardless of what you decide to do and regardless of black's initiative, white is going to be significantly better according to the engine. So the from Gambit is bad for black. It's as simple as that. If you're an engine, the from Gambit is bad. If you're a human, inexperienced as white, you could lose. So let's look at knight f3 first. Personally, I always take on d6 because black has the same type of initiative whether you take or not, and I would rather be a clean pawn up. Why wouldn't I be 2 pawns up? So takes, excuse me, d takes e5, knight takes e5. And if we do this, you're up a pawn and black is going to play bishop d6, Now you have to bring the knight back, and g5. g5 is the most common attacking idea in the from gambit for black. The point is, we are trying to misplace this knight. Let me just show you what would happen if white played a stupid move. If you played a3, for example, then g4 and you're immediately losing. You cannot move this knight. Let's say you do. Let's say you don't see why you're losing, so you move the knight. Queen h4 is mate in 3. The only way to defend mate is g3, and then takes, and checkmate. So g5 is a strong idea. And against g5, you have to be careful. There is only one reasonable move, g3. And g3 does one very simple thing. It prevents g4 and queen h4 check. Now black is going to play g4 anyway. We have to play knight h4. There are no other reasonable moves. Knight h4. The reason knight h4 is a good move is because now black has a new plan. Let's go h5, h4, undermine this pawn, attack the pawn. The h-pawn is pinned because the rooks are looking at each other and the rook on h1 isn't defended. So we would lose material and once again get mated. That is why knight h4, blocking the advance of the h-pawn, is by far the best move. Now black continues doing the same thing, knight e7. The move needs very little explanation. The knight is coming to g6. Black wants to take on h4 and keep pushing the g-pawn with checkmate. For example, white's best move is d4, knight g6. If we make a stupid move again, then takes. I suppose you want to take your piece back, and yeah, that's it. I don't know. Now your king can escape, but it's still dreadful. It's awful. So on knight g6, we have to take that knight. Knight takes. Okay, black of course takes with the h-pawn, and now that there is no h-pawn, there is only one threat left, and that's bishop takes g3. Bishop g3 is a devastating threat because the rook isn't defended, and we either have to defend the pawn or defend the rook. I don't like defending the pawn, the rook, excuse me, with bishop to g2. I prefer the move queen d3, and that's the main theoretical move. Now the g3 pawn is defended, and the counterplay is gone. Knight c6. c3, overprotecting d4 to make sure we don't lose to a double attack. Let's say bishop e6. There are other moves at this point. For example, bishop e2, queen e7, knight d2. And our plan long term is to go e4. But if you can reduce the amount of material, you should. So knight e4 is the best move. And now you're just going to snap this bishop off. There will be no trouble on g3. And if you turn on the engine says plus 0.4. But white is, from a practical standpoint, much better because there is no more counterplay. f5, f4 could be coming, but we're not obliged to castle either side just yet. We are going to have the bishop pair with a very pleasant position. However, if you want maximum advantage for white against the from gambit, you take on d6. Once again, bishop takes d6. And now we have not lost a tempo moving this knight back and forth, so on. So knight f3. g5 transposes to the same line. However, if black doesn't play g5, black can play knight f6. Black can play bishop g4. Black can play knight c6. I mean, neither of these are challenging, so I'm going to show them to you very, very briefly, and we're going to focus on the main move. I should also say that after knight f3, d5, white has a way to avoid all of this. If you want to avoid the from gambit, on knight f3 takes, knight e5, bishop d6 transposes to the main line, where you take on d6. But if you want to avoid all the complications, on d5 just go e4, and now you have a normal position. I should have mentioned that before when I started showing knight f3. You don't want to, if you play knight f3, then that means that you're not willing to go into the from properly. So you can go e4, it's fine, and it's about equal. But again, my recommendation, take or go knight f3 and then transpose to the main line. Bishop takes d6, knight f3, g5. Okay, now maximum advantage. g3, g4, knight h4. Black has several ways to play. Black can play knight e7, black can play f5, many other moves. On knight e7, d4 plays for the maximum advantage. Knight g6, we already saw this. I would recommend that in this position you don't take on g6. Here is what I do. I go knight g2. Now, the engine gives it as about equal compared to knight takes g6, but we are giving black the option to advance the h-pawn, and I think we're setting up a pretty cunning trap. So black should go h5. If they don't, then, there's no downside to knight g2, so h5. And now most people play e4 in order to play e5, but that's sharp and too complicated. Play the move queen d3 regardless. And if black continues with h4, now we go knight f4. And I think this is an extremely pleasant setup. And more importantly, if black plays knight e7, knight g6, they are going to continue with h5, h4 if allowed. I mean, otherwise, why did you play knight g6? Now, knight f4 is really strong. We're threatening to take on g6, so black must react. Taking on f4 is a really bad idea. The engine gives it as almost +1. The best move according to the engine is knight e7. What initiative? What initiative? Why are you down a pawn with a completely busted pawn structure? So again, I think most people are going to take. Knight takes f4. Now we take with the bishop. Taking once again is again very bad. The best move is knight c6. If you take again, then gf4. And now we're going to go e3, not e4, completely solidifying the structure. g3 can never be played because this rook is hanging, and this is more than +1. So if you want my advice against the from gambit, on knight g6, don't take that knight. Knight g2. And I think this is extremely, extremely interesting. And white should be better in most lines. Now let's briefly look at alternatives to g5. If black doesn't play g5, the opening really isn't challenging. Knight f6 is the most common alternative, but it's just, I mean, I don't even understand what it does. I have faced it a couple of times, but it's not scary. Just go g3. Black is going to go h5 again, most likely. If they don't, then there really is no possibility for compensation. And now, against this, I don't recommend d4, I recommend d3. If h4, we just take. Not with the knight, we take with the pawn. And why did you give up all that material? Bishop g4, trying to take the pawn on h4, but now just bishop g2, and white is, needless to say, perfectly fine and has a big advantage. So knight f6, not challenging. Bishop g4 is slightly more challenging, but not really, because the pawn will never be able to reach g4, and the h-pawn will not be in time to cause any significant issues. So against bishop g4, we actually don't go g3. Why would we? We go e3. We defend the knight. And after knight f6, we go bishop e2. I mean, you could still lose on h2 if you're not careful. Maybe knight e4, queen h4 after takes the knight. But this, definitely not challenging. It's about plus 0.5 for white, but most importantly, there are no tricks. It's simple to play, and black is still going to castle queenside and try to destroy you, but you really should not lose from this position. And one more move we have to consider is knight c6. Knight c6 is interesting. It plays for e5 and d4, but again, it's not too challenging. I like the move knight c3 against this, and then e4, playing a normal, I don't even know what to call this, but it's just a normal opening. You can continue with bishop b5 here, for example. You don't have to. You can go bishop c4, but it's just a normal game. It's a normal position. You're going to go d4 at some point and castle, and you're going to have a better center because black has no central pawns. Okay, now let us start with the reverse Dutch. The from gambit is the sharpest line many people play, and online you will encounter that probably 6 out of 10 games, at least I do. However, d5 is the most common move in tournament play. Now, this move is a reverse Dutch. Once again, choose one of the setups. The classical setup, the Leningrad setup or the Stonewall setup, you get to choose a setup here. Okay, whatever black plays. Black can play, I don't know, the reverse London, which I used to do against this. Now I don't anymore. Black can play with bishop g4. Black can play a Grunfeld type of position with g6, bishop g7. Black can play a normal queen's gambit with d5, c5, knight c6, e6. Black can play b6. Black can play many different setups. Whatever they do, choose your setup. As I said, g3 is the most common way to play the Leningrad setup, and it's the best way to play. So I'm going to be showing you that, despite the fact that I personally play the classical. So after knight f3, black here can play. Okay, I'll show you what I did first. I would always play bishop f5 here, and as white, I would play the classical here. I should say that against bishop f5 and bishop g4, I wouldn't recommend going for the Leningrad setup with g3. I would recommend that you play the classical either way. Black will play e6. I'm sorry, my mouse is kind of buggy. Bishop to e2. Black is playing the London system. White is playing the classical Dutch. Knight f6, castles. Bishop e7. It doesn't make sense for black to play bishop d6 because there's a pawn on f4. So when I had black here, I would always go bishop e7. c4, I like challenging black's London system center, castles, b3, and now the bishop is coming to b2. It's just, this is, I think, pleasant for white, although I do play it with both colors. I don't see a flaw with black's position. However, black has far less activity. If black goes bishop g4 and plays the sort of Tory attack and not the London system, then we do the same thing, e3, classical Dutch. And one nuance I would like to mention here is that since the bishop is on g4 and we're threatening to win the bishop, we can throw in h3. This is a pattern you have to know in the bird. We go h3, and if the bishop declines the trade, then that's about it. We have a pawn on f4, we just win the bishop. So on h3, black pretty much has to take. Bishop e6 makes no sense and also runs into g4, f5. So takes. Now we have the bishop pair. The diagonal from e1 to h4 isn't really a problem because we always have queen f2 and g3. We're attacking the pawn on d5, and we have many attacking options here. We don't have to castle kingside. I personally don't because it's very risky. I wait for black to commit their king first. So for example, c6, d4, e6, bishop d3, bishop d6, castles is possible here, but again, I would recommend that you don't. Depending on your setup here, I like to play the Stonewall, sort of. I like to go c3, knight d2, move the queen, knight f3, knight e5, but you can also castle. You can also play a4, you can play c4, you can play knight c3, knight e2. There are many playable variations. I actually had one game where I played knight c3, 2, g3, h5, g4, and put pressure on g7. Black castled too early and ended up getting mated. Okay, other setups will transpose to different major openings, so I don't want to mention them by name. I just want to focus on what white should be doing. Most commonly, black will play either knight f6 or c5 or g6, and they will probably lead to the same position because that's the Dutch in reverse. So if d4 is white, f5 the Dutch, white usually plays c4. In this case, black usually plays c5. Now again, you can play the Stonewall, you can play the classical. No one's preventing you from going e3, d4, c3, or e3, bishop, e2, castles, but I think g3 is the best setup. And most strong players agree. Knight c6, again, black is just playing the queen's gambit. Bishop g2, g6. This is the way you fight the Dutch. If you've ever had white against the Dutch in mainline d4, c4 openings, then this is what you do. Castles, bishop g7, d3. Okay, eventually we may be playing for c4 or e4. Most likely for c4. So e4 is a very risky pawn break, and sometimes it pays to have this pawn remain flexible so that you can play e3, shutting down the d4 square. But also, if you move your queen, you can play for e4. Know that this diagonal will be extremely weak. So I would recommend that you play for c4, challenging the center from the flank. Now, black can play many different moves here. Knight f6 is one of them. e6. Black can also go d4, simply expanding and preventing any c4 ideas. If this happens, white should be better, and you should go c3, just undermining that straight away. This is a theoretical line though, so it's fine for black. Knight h6, and now e4. We have to break the center. We're not playing c4, we play e4. d3, bishop e3. You will see something like this many times. This sort of position in the Leningrad. And you're playing for these two extremely good bishops. You obviously don't have a strong kingside attack, but your position is very safe. Your bishop is going to sit on f2. Your rook has a very natural square on e1. The knight usually comes out to a3 in most cases, or c3, a4 if you manage to move the c-pawn. And sometimes a3, c2, d4 becomes an option, because then you have a bishop, two knights, and the queen defending d4. Personally, that's what I like to do. So most people are not going to play d4, however. Most people are going to play knight f6, and then if you allow d4 to come with tempo, they should play d4. But I like this as well. I like tempting black into playing d4, because after d4 we have knight a4. And this knight has a pretty bright future. We're going to play c4 at some point, and if this is taken en passant, then we are going to recapture with the knight. And for the moment, b5 doesn't work because c5 is hanging. So black needs to defend, for example, like this. And now we go c4. b5 has been prevented. Taking en passant is just bad. That should not be done, because we have great access to these two squares with the knight on c3. So, for example, castles, a3, and now we're playing the English. You're going to be switching plans in the reverse Dutch or in the bird, because now we're switching to rook b1. I don't know what's wrong with my mouse, but yeah, I'm sorry. Rook b1 and b4, and expanding on the queen side. Now let's continue with Sicilian setups. c5. I should say that if you want to stick to the bird, you should just ignore what black is doing and basically say, oh, you want to play a Sicilian, I don't care, we're playing the bird, and I'm sticking to my setup. So once again, choose one of the three: classical, Leningrad, or Stonewall. However, if you want to play precisely, if you want to play for an optimal advantage, play the Grand Prix. I know that that's not the bird at all. That's not the Dutch at all. People do not consider the Grand Prix a part of the bird opening, but it is. If you want to see a detailed video on the Grand Prix, I have made it. You can watch that. It's going to help. In short, e4 is the best move because black has done nothing to defend the the e4 square. Black has not played d5. Black has not played knight f6. Simply put, e4 expanding in the center is the best way to play. However, you now have no way of avoiding the Sicilian. So for example, knight c6, knight c3, you have a very standard Sicilian defense game, the Grand Prix attack after g6, knight f3. There are tens of thousands of games from this position. You can play bishop b5, bishop c4, g3, d3, a4, many moves. I'm not going to go into Grand Prix theory. I will just say that you have a choice here. If c5 is played, either play knight f3 and continue with the classical Leningrad or the Stonewall, or play e4 for a maximum advantage. If you play knight f3, it's very likely that black is going to play d5 at some point, or g6 or knight f6, and play their own thing. Okay, now let's have a look at knight f6. If f4, knight f6, there are two possibilities. Option number one. First of all, the e4 square is defended, so we're not playing for e4. You're going to play one of your three setups. Option number one. Black plays knight f6, and they will transpose to a Dutch in reverse after d5. That's possible. Option number 2, black will play a King's Indian or Old Indian type of setup with d6 and with or without g6. Against d6 and g6, the King's Indian, we do the same thing. We just don't care. We don't care. g6, once again, I would recommend g3, but you can also play the classical or the Stonewall. And now if they go d6, or let's say bishop g7 first, for example, d3, we're playing this. If they go d6, it's equal, and black is playing their King's Indian stuff. We are playing our Leningrad stuff. We are both ignoring each other. Black will at some point play e5, and we will do e4 if allowed. Before that, we will play bishop g2 and castle, decide what to do with the knight and the bishop on the queen side. There really is no theory here. So help yourself by learning your setup, learning the ideas in one of the 3 setups. I've shown you the classical, the Leningrad, and the Stonewall. This is very rarely played, but people who play the King's Indian and don't know anything else are going to try to play the King's Indian. The good news for us is that f5 really doesn't do anything. We have a pawn on f4. So the King's Indian is not played against the bird or the Dutch in reverse because it simply makes no sense. Makes no sense. We already have a pawn on f4, so even e5 isn't playable. And finally, if black starts with g6 or any other rare move, we have to adjust. g6 usually signals one of 2 things. The reverse Dutch after d5, c5, bishop g7, knight f6. We know what to do against that. Or again, the King's Indian with d6, knight f6, and so on. And we know what to do against that as well. So rare moves can usually be reduced to a known setup. One rare move, which we have to mention, is f5. Okay, if black plays f5 trying to copy us, we are going to be the first to do something to change the nature of the position and break the symmetry. So knight f3, knight f6, g3, g6. Again, black could go for the classical or the Stonewall themselves. This is just the best way to play. Bishop g2, bishop g7. And now we are the first to strike, c4. Now, of course, black doesn't want to play d5 here, trading off the d pawn for the c pawn. Black is going to play d6 and now d4. And this may seem strange to a bird or Dutch player, but black has a pawn on f5. We haven't really lost control over the e4 square because we have knight c3. And if we manage to take that knight, then after knight d2, the pawn on e4 will be very weak. So basically, black is playing the Leningrad Dutch, and we are playing a Queen's Gambit Leningrad hybrid where we have a bunch of space in the center. We are forever playing against e5, and black will likely have to play for c5. So something like this is likely. Knight c3, c6, castles, knight a6, a3, rook b8, black is playing for b5, bishop e1, and also getting away from the bishop on g2. We are playing for e4, black is playing on the flank, and white, of course, has an advantage. So playing a symmetrical setup against the bird is definitely not a good idea. One more thing that I would like to mention, if my mouse allows it, is knight c6. Against this, even though the e4 square is available and we could go e4, do not play e4. Against knight c6, if you go e4, black will play d5 and have a very good Nimzowitsch defense. Especially if black knows the Nimzowitsch, you're going to be in trouble. So against knight c6, just continue knight f3 and play your normal stuff. d5, e3, let's say bishop g4, just stick to your setup. I like the move, bishop b5. I like the move bishop b5 here instead of bishop e2 because the knight is under threat. So why not? The knight is on c6. You can also go bishop e2. You can also, instead of e3, play g3. You can also play the Stonewall. It doesn't really matter. One last move. If instead of knight c6, black plays b6, I would recommend that you go e4. I don't know what to call this. I have no idea, probably the English or the Owen. You could reach this position via 1 e4, b6, black plays the English or the Owen, and you go f4, perfectly playable. So just claiming the center makes a lot of sense. At some point, black is either going to go d5 or c5, and you will have something like an Imzu Larsen in reverse. I don't know. This is just a Queen's Indian for black now, so people who play the Queen's Indian may play this. I would recommend that you deviate from the bird and play e4 on move 2. Okay, so I hope you managed to arm you well enough to play the bird with white. If you need more on all the key setups, there are separate videos on the Grand Prix, on the Leningrad, on the Stonewall, and on the Classical. I would recommend that you watch them, at least the one that you choose to play. So if you want to play the Stonewall, watch the one on the Stonewall. It will help because I gave a ton of details in those videos. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.